There's a peculiar arrogance that settles into the bones of long-serving politicians, a kind of armor built from decades of winning rooms and shaping outcomes. Senator Lindsey Graham had worn that armor for nearly 30 years, and on the morning of that Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, he wore it like an old suit he'd forgotten was even on his body. He didn't prepare. Not really. His staffers had assembled briefing books, but Graham barely glanced at them. He didn't need to. Or so he believed. He had questioned Supreme Court nominees, debated presidential candidates, weathered political storms that would have destroyed lesser politicians. A freshman representative from Texas named Jasmine Crockett sitting at the witness table didn't register as a threat. It barely registered as worth his full attention. This is the story of what happens when that arrogance meets preparation it never saw coming. This is about the moment a seasoned senator became the cautionary tale, and a young legislator became something far more powerful than viral. But before we get there, before the confrontation that would dominate news cycles and social media for weeks, we need to understand something crucial, what Graham didn't see when he looked across that committee room. Crockett had spent her entire career being underestimated. As a civil rights attorney, she'd faced judges who dismissed her, opposing counsel who attempted intimidation, systems designed to make her doubt herself. She had learned something most people never truly absorb. Preparation isn't just about knowing your material. Preparation is about knowing your opponent better than they know themselves. In the weeks leading up to this hearing, while Graham was attending coffee meetings and reviewing polling updates, Crockett's team was constructing something far more valuable than talking points. They were building a detailed architectural blueprint of Graham's entire political career. Every position he'd held, every reversal he'd made, every contradiction lurking in the record. They didn't just gather information. They organized it strategically, weaponizing his own words against him. Graham arrived at the committee room with the casual confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. The Capitol building itself seemed to defer to him after 3 decades. The marble corridors, the leather chairs, the protocols and procedures, he didn't just know them. He moved through them as though he'd written them into existence. Crockett arrived earlier, sitting quietly at the witness table, taking meticulous notes. She watched Graham interact with other witnesses. She noticed his pattern with surgical precision. Let them speak briefly, then interrupt with pointed questions designed to destabilize. A civil rights advocate before Crockett had been interrupted multiple times, visibly frustrated. Graham's method was straightforward. Control the narrative by controlling who was allowed to speak. Most people fell for it. They became defensive, emotional, easy to dismiss as passionate but lacking substance. Graham believed Crockett would follow the same script. He believed her age meant inexperience. Her passion meant she could be rattled. Her first-term status meant she didn't understand how power actually worked in these rooms. Every assumption was about to become spectacularly wrong. What separates this moment from countless other political confrontations is not that it was dramatic, though it was. What separates it is that it represented something deeper, a collision between 2 different philosophies of power itself. Graham believed power came from position, from seniority, from the institutional authority that decades had granted him. He believed that a senator could dismiss a representative simply because he had earned the right to be dismissive. Crockett believed something different. She believed power came from preparation, from authenticity, from refusing to accept the frame someone else tried to force upon you. These weren't just 2 politicians about to have an exchange. They were 2 entirely different approaches to authority meeting head-on in front of cameras and span viewers and journalists furiously typing in the press gallery. The hearing itself began unremarkably. Procedural, routine, exactly what everyone expected. Senators shuffled papers. Staffers whispered in corners. The room carried that particular Capitol building energy where nothing seemed urgent until suddenly everything was. After nearly 2 hours of other witnesses, Crockett's moment arrived. She began her testimony with clarity and passion, grounding abstract voting rights policy in real human stories. Maria Gonzalez, a 67-year-old grandmother, turned away from voting because of a minor registration issue. James Washington, a veteran forced to wait hours after his polling place was relocated without notice. These weren't abstract issues. These were real people facing real obstacles in the most fundamental democratic process. Her testimony was thorough, well-researched, delivered with unwavering conviction. This is where most politicians would have impressed the committee and moved on. But Crockett wasn't most politicians. Graham's patience fractured midway through her testimony. He leaned forward, interrupting sharply, his tone dripping with a condescension so thick it seemed to coat the entire committee room. "Representative Crockett," he said, and his slow southern drawl stretched the syllables into something almost mocking. "I appreciate your passion, but you're making this far more complicated than it needs to be." The room stiffened. Journalists in the gallery immediately sensed the shift. Something was about to happen. Crockett paused, but she didn't appear flustered. She kept her composure, eyes focused, breathing steady. This was the moment Graham believed he'd landed his opening blow, the moment when he could establish dominance through dismissal. He pressed forward, boasting about his tenure in the Senate, criticizing her understanding of election administration, suggesting that her approach was exactly what was wrong with modern politics. Emotion over substance. Theatrics over policy. He was performing for the Republican senators around him, and several nodded approvingly. Democratic senators shifted uneasily, recognizing that Graham had crossed from tough questioning into mockery. What Graham didn't understand was that Crockett had been waiting for exactly this moment. She had anticipated his condescension because she had studied his patterns. She knew that when he felt threatened, he relied on authority and dismissal rather than argument. She responded with measured precision, her voice steady and cutting in a way that demanded attention. "Senator Graham," she said evenly, "I understand the complexities perfectly. I spent years as a civil rights attorney representing clients denied the right to vote. I have studied the legislative history extensively." It was a perfect response because it didn't accept his frame. She didn't become defensive. She didn't match his condescension. She simply stated fact and competence, refusing his attempt to diminish her expertise. Graham, however, was far from finished. He waved his hand dismissively, a gesture caught by every camera in the room. "This is the United States Senate. The real work happens here. Your approach is exactly what's wrong with politics today. All emotion, no substance." This was the moment. This was when Graham made the critical error that would define him in this exchange. He didn't just disagree with Crockett, he mocked her. He treated her passion for voting rights as though it were a character flaw rather than a moral conviction. He positioned himself as the serious player and her as the earnest amateur. Crockett straightened in her chair, and everyone watching could feel the shift in energy. Her voice remained calm, but it had acquired an edge that hadn't been there before. "Senator Graham," she began, and the room seemed to grow colder. "It's fascinating you lecture me about policy and substance when your record over the past several years demonstrates a lack of both." Graham's expression flickered. This wasn't the response he'd anticipated. Senators leaned forward. Social media clips began circulating in real time. People watching on C-SPAN suddenly grabbed their phones. Crockett opened her briefcase with deliberate precision, each movement calculated to build tension. "Since we're discussing how things work," she continued, her tone precise and unyielding, "let me remind you of your own record." Graham attempted to interrupt, but Crockett cut him off sharply. "You interrupted me multiple times during my testimony. I am entitled to respond to your characterization of my work, unless you want to explain to the American people why you can dish it out but can't take it." The committee chairman shifted uneasily but stayed silent. Graham leaned back in his chair, and it became visibly clear that he no longer controlled the room. The dynamic had shifted. Crockett's voice grew stronger. "You mentioned your long tenure, nearly 30 years in Congress. During that time, you've reversed positions on nearly every major issue depending on which way the political wind was blowing. Let me remind you of the facts." She opened her folder with careful precision. The blue cover stood out against the polished wood of the table. Every senator in that room recognized what was happening. Crockett wasn't venting. She wasn't being emotional. She was about to methodically dismantle Graham's credibility with surgical precision. She read each contradiction, each reversal with the careful deliberation of a prosecutor presenting evidence. In 2016, you called Donald Trump a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. You said nominating him would destroy the Republican Party. Those are your words, Senator. I have the transcripts if you want me to read them aloud. Several senators shifted in discomfort. Reporters frantically typed in the press gallery. Social media was already moving, but most people watching hadn't yet realized they were witnessing something that would fundamentally alter the conversation about generational power in American politics. Crockett continued, her delivery flawless. Once he became president, however, you became one of his most loyal defenders. You praised him, you played golf with him, you defended every action, completely contradicting your prior statements. She paused, letting that sink in. So when you lecture me on substance and policy, understand this. I stand by the positions I advocate. I don't change my principles for political convenience. Some Democratic senators tried not to smile. Even a few Republicans appeared genuinely unsettled. The moment had acquired a weight that transcended partisan lines. This wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans anymore. This was about something larger, about authenticity versus calculation, about conviction versus convenience. Crockett leaned forward, fixing Graham with unwavering focus. Let's talk about voting rights specifically. In 2006, you voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, calling it essential to democracy. After the Supreme Court weakened it in 2013, you refused to support restoration efforts. When states began passing restrictive laws that disproportionately affected black and brown voters, you remained silent. When I highlighted these exact issues in my testimony, you dismissed them as emotion over substance. Here's what I actually understand, Senator. You've been in Washington so long, you've forgotten what it means to stand for something. Silence fell across the room, total and suffocating. Graham opened his mouth, but no words came. His colleagues avoided eye contact. The moment had slipped entirely from his control, and everyone watching understood it. This wasn't a senator regaining footing. This was a politician recognizing in real time that he had severely miscalculated. Crockett continued, her voice steady and measured. You're so comfortable with power that you think you can dismiss anyone who challenges you. And most importantly, you underestimated me. The words hung in the air like a pronouncement. Graham attempted a response, his voice noticeably weaker than moments before. Representative Crockett, I think you're being emotional, passionate, not understanding how things work. But the moment he said it, he realized his error. He was repeating the same dismissive framework that had already failed him twice. Crockett's response was immediate and devastating. Her voice cut like a knife through warm butter, clean and precise. Or am I being exactly what you cannot handle? A black woman prepared with facts and receipts, refusing to tolerate condescension. The room reacted instantly. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Democratic senators nodded. Some Republicans looked shocked. Cameras captured every reaction, every facial expression, every moment of Graham's visible discomfort. What happened in that instant was something that transcends traditional political discourse. Crockett didn't just respond to Graham's argument. She named the actual architecture of his dismissal. She identified the mechanism he was using, and in doing so, she moved the conversation from the specific policy debate to something far more universal. She was speaking to every person who had ever been diminished based on identity. Every young person told they didn't understand how things worked. Every woman spoken over by a man who believed his experience outweighed her expertise. Every person of color expected to be grateful for a seat at the table rather than demand respect at it. She was doing something that most politicians avoid entirely because it's dangerous and requires tremendous courage. She was naming the thing that everyone could see, but that political protocol usually forbids speaking aloud. Graham tried once more to regain control. I think we should move on to the next order of business. But Crockett's voice remained calm, almost gentle, which made it far more powerful than if she had shouted. We can move on when you're ready, but hear me clearly. When you try to diminish me, dismiss my work, mock my passion for justice, you're attacking more than just me. You're attacking every young person who believes politics can be better. Every person of color who has been told they don't belong. Every woman who's been spoken over by men who think their experience outweighs her expertise. She gathered her papers with deliberate care, and the room remained silent. The moment felt etched into history even as it was still happening. I came here to testify about voting rights because every American deserves their voice to be heard in our democracy. You tried to silence mine, you failed. And that, Senator Graham, is what I understand about how things work. She leaned back in her chair with the composure of someone who had said exactly what needed to be said and had no regrets. Graham didn't respond. The committee chairman, recognizing that the moment had fundamentally shifted and that nothing he could say would restore normal order, quickly called a recess. Graham left the room without making eye contact with anyone, his confidence visibly shaken, his swagger absent. What had been a room where he believed he held all authority had become a space where he was the smaller figure. Within minutes, the exchange exploded online in a way that no one watching could have predicted. The clip began circulating across every major social media platform simultaneously. It wasn't just the usual political junkies sharing it. Regular people were sharing it. People who never engaged with political content. The clip moved through Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook like a virus spreading through a network, each share adding exponential reach. Hashtags began trending worldwide within the first hour. Not just trending, absolutely dominating. The algorithm itself seemed to recognize that this moment was different from typical political content. This wasn't just a gotcha moment in a hearing. This was something that resonated across demographic lines because it was about something universal, the vindication of preparation meeting arrogance, authenticity crushing condescension, someone refusing to accept a diminished role. Within the first 24 hours, the clip reached over 50 million views across all platforms combined. Over 5 million impressions on Twitter alone in just the first hour. Mainstream media outlets picked up the story before the hearing had even reconvened. Cable news channels began breaking into regular programming. CNN brought in analysts to break down Crockett's rhetorical strategy. MSNBC praised her composure and her methodical approach. Even Fox News, despite the network's general allegiance to Republican figures, had to acknowledge that Graham had been outmaneuvered. The New York Times ran an analysis titled, "How a Freshman Representative Schooled a Senate Veteran." The Washington Post described it as a generational shift in Democratic politics. Politico produced an in-depth piece analyzing Graham's political pivots and the strategic precision with which Crockett had weaponized them against him. Morning talk shows disrupted their scheduled programming to discuss it. On Morning Joe, the exchange was dissected for nearly 20 minutes with multiple political experts brought in to analyze the significance. The View brought in commentators to discuss what it meant for gender and race dynamics in Congress. Late-night comedy programs incorporated it into their monologues. Stephen Colbert joked that Graham got read like a bedtime story by a woman who had done her homework better than he had done his. Jimmy Fallon created a humorous segment about confidence versus preparation. The moment had transcended the typical lifespan of viral political content. Usually, these things peak within hours and then fade into the background noise of the internet. This one kept growing. Memes spread comparing Graham's confident smirk before the exchange to his stunned expression afterward. GIFs of Crockett's measured delivery circulated widely. Remixes appeared. Young people created TikTok videos analyzing her technique. Political communication professors were already discussing using the exchange as a case study in their courses. Within 72 hours, the moment had become something more than viral. It had become culturally significant. For the first 24 hours after the hearing, Lindsey Graham maintained public silence. His social media accounts were unusually quiet. No statements. No retweets. No attempts to control the narrative. A brief statement from his office claimed he stood by his questions and found the hearing productive, but nobody believed it. The statement felt like something generated by a damage control team, and it had the hollow ring of damage control. Republican colleagues remained silent or quietly admitted he had miscalculated. Some younger Republican staffers confided to reporters that moments like this were precisely why their party struggled to connect with younger voters. They understood what had happened. A seasoned politician had been outmaneuvered by someone who had refused to play by the old rules of deference and hierarchy. 3 days later, Graham addressed the exchange during a Fox News interview. He chose his words carefully, almost robotically. "I think Representative Crockett is a talented person," he said. "We had a spirited exchange, which is what hearings are for. I don't think either of us said anything we regret." But his body language told a completely different story. The confident swagger that had defined his demeanor during the hearing was gone, replaced by visible discomfort and a stiffness that suggested he was reading from an internal script. He looked like someone trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince viewers, for Jasmine Crockett, that hearing became a career-defining moment in the truest sense. Her social media following exploded almost overnight, gaining over 2 million followers within just 1 week. Donations poured in from small-dollar contributors nationwide. Progressive organizations reached out to collaborate on initiatives. Speaking invitations flooded in. Universities wanted her to visit. Podcast hosts wanted her to appear. The viral moment had transformed her from a promising freshman representative into a national political figure. But here's what separated Crockett from politicians who ride viral moments to temporary fame. She was disciplined about not letting the moment overshadow her actual work. In interviews following the hearing, she repeatedly refocused attention on the substance of voting rights. When journalists wanted to discuss the personal dynamics of the confrontation, she redirected the conversation to the policy. "I didn't go viral to get attention," she told one reporter. "I went to fight for my constituents and Americans facing obstacles at the polls. If my response gets attention, that's fine. But the real story is about protecting democracy and ensuring every voice counts in elections." This strategic focus was precisely what transformed a viral moment into sustained political credibility. She wasn't riding a wave. She was building a foundation. Her colleagues in the House took notice quickly. Democratic leadership began inviting her to higher-profile committee assignments. She appeared on Sunday morning political shows, showcasing the same expertise and policy knowledge that had impressed everyone during the Graham exchange. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she transformed from a viral sensation into a serious political force. She was being treated differently by senior colleagues. Her voice carried more weight in caucus meetings. Younger representatives looked to her as a model. The exchange also sparked a broader conversation about generational change in American politics that extended far beyond one hearing. Political scientists and commentators across the spectrum noted how a younger, more diverse Congress was challenging traditional authority structures, refusing to defer to seniority alone and using social media strategically in political battles. The old rules about respecting hierarchy and accepting diminishment seemed to be collapsing. Veteran politicians adjusted their strategies, realizing they couldn't underestimate younger lawmakers, who had prepared more thoroughly and understood media dynamics better than their predecessors. The incident highlighted something fundamental about modern political power that transcends any single confrontation. Preparation now matters more than position. Authenticity resonates more than authority. Refusing to accept the frame someone tries to force upon you is more powerful than all the seniority in the world. Months later, the exchange continued to be studied, analyzed, and referenced. Political communication professors used it as a case study in their courses. Young, aspiring politicians cited it as inspiration for how to navigate confrontation with more powerful figures. Democratic candidates referenced her example in competitive races to show voters the value of standing firm against powerful opponents. For Graham, the confrontation became a cautionary note in his long career. Articles and profiles mentioned the incident as a marker of shifting political landscapes. The Washington establishment understood the lesson. Underestimating prepared newcomers could backfire spectacularly. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing that Graham had expected to be routine became the moment that redefined how power functions in contemporary American politics. Crockett didn't win because she was more aggressive or more photogenic or more media savvy. She won because she had prepared more thoroughly. She had refused to accept condescension. She had named the actual mechanism of her diminishment and refused to participate in it. In doing so, she didn't just win an exchange. She demonstrated a new template for how younger politicians could challenge established power. And in a Congress increasingly filled with diverse, ambitious, and thoroughly prepared representatives, that template was going to matter far more than any senator's decades of seniority.